I'm going to let you play jury. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you the facts of a case, and I'm going to ask you to rate the case on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is weak and 10 is strong. And after I give you these facts, I'm just going to ask you basically for what your rating is. All right, is that fair? And I'll give you the facts one at a time. So this is a case that involved a victim who was assaulted by a person with whom she had a brief encounter. Okay, so it wasn't a boyfriend, it wasn't a husband, it wasn't a stranger. It was somebody that she knew kind of start to finish for probably about 1 hour's time. She was actually at work and on duty during the time that she was assaulted. She had been sent on a special assignment by her boss that was to take about 30 minutes. And it was during that 30-minute period of time that she was away from her main duties at work and on this special assignment that she was assaulted. She was supposed to, after this special assignment, if you will, she was supposed to come back and debrief with some people. There were about 3 people waiting to talk to her. And she was supposed to debrief about what happened on the special assignment, you know, like how that went. Rather than stopping and debriefing with them, she ran past them. And they described her as being clearly traumatized. This is a victim that happened to have blonde hair. And as she ran past these people that she was supposed to stop and talk to, they described her as a blonde streak, okay, who kind of ran through this public area. And she was supposed to, it was against protocol for her to not talk to them. She went and she found her best friend, who also worked with her, and she made immediate outcry to him, and she told him what had happened. It was the end of the shift. She said, I need to get out of here. And so he said, I'll sign out too. Let me make sure you get home okay. Let me drive you home. And she said, no, I want to drive myself. He said, fine, then let me follow you. So he followed her. She drove her car, and he drove his car all the way to get her home safely. And this 19-year-old girl drove 15 miles under the speed limit on her way back to where she lived. The best friend encouraged her to call the police, and she was not ready to do that. And so she didn't want to do that. He was so upset, the best friend was so upset by what had happened to his best friend that he woke his father up in the middle of the night to tell him about the rape and to tell him what had happened. Again, she was encouraged to call the police, and she was not in a place to do that. She got home that night, she let her parents know that she was okay. She went to bed, tried to sleep, had a fitful night of sleep, and about 11 o'clock the next day, basically her life was imploding, okay? The reality of what happened hit her, and her world was caving in on her. And so she knew that she needed some help, and so she called someone that she trusted, not the police, but she called her mom, and she told her mom what had happened the night before, and her mother came home from work to assist her daughter. And her mother, of course, called police. All right, so police get involved, and they tell her, listen, will you go for a forensic examination? You know, we need to do this. And she said, sure. So she went for a forensic examination, a sane examination where they look for injury and that kind of thing. This is a case that did result in injury. This is a victim who had 2 bleeding tears near her posterior fourchette, which is the vagina is basically shaped like a football. Posterior fourchette is toward the bottom and toward the back, and so there were 2 1-centimeter bleeding tears that were noted. In addition, she had numerous pinpoint injuries up higher in the anatomy near the cervical opening. And so, if you will, this is kind of akin to a almost like non-lubricated friction, so maybe almost like a rug burn, if you will, but internally. Okay, that kind of injury was also noted. And finally, the nurse noticed that she had a bruise on her neck. This is a defendant who held her and basically strangled her from behind and held her neck and squeezed in order to get her to submit. And that left a thumbprint bruise, which you can see up here inside the ruler as well as just on the side of her chin. Now, I told you that these were bleeding injuries, so the defendant, when he finished, he wiped himself off with his t-shirt. So the victim bled onto his penis, and then he wiped himself off with this t-shirt. This is the t-shirt you see inside those blue squares there. That is blood. That's the victim's blood. So those are the DNA and forensic markings for her blood. Within a short period of time, probably within 36 hours, they talked to the defendant or the suspect. And at first he denied that there was any sexual contact. He said he was married and there was no sex. Then they confronted him with the fact that she had been for a DNA examination, forensic examination, and he changed his story and said, okay, then it was consensual. And finally, during the course of this interview, he admitted to having his hands around her neck during the course of this assault, okay? So within the first, like I said, maybe 36 hours, this is the state's case. This is the evidence that as it developed in this particular rape case. And so my question for you is, what's your rating? On a scale of 1 to 10, tell me, where are you? 1 is weak, 10 is strong.
10.
All right, so strong case, fair enough. And that is because of the influence of the unnamed conspirator, as well as the fact that there was a gag order in place, meaning that the prosecution team was not allowed to discuss the case publicly to the press or anyone else. So you shouldn't hear those facts, right? You don't want the case tried in the media. You want the case tried in the courtroom. But you didn't hear any of that. What you saw more typically were kind of pictures of him, maybe with his defense attorney, kind of walking at the courthouse. There was a lot of publicity about this case because he's such a superstar. But there was a whole other piece of this that you didn't know, and that I really need to make sure that I communicate to you, and that is what the reality was for this particular victim. Okay, so this is a survivor who, first of all, during the course of the prosecution of this case, she had to move to 5 different states just to avoid the very aggressive media, the investigators, that kind of thing. She'd get set up someplace, people would figure out who she was, they'd drop a dime on the media, and she'd have to move. She finally talked her into getting some support from a psychologist, and this psychologist offered to sell her confidential records to the Globe. And so that, her world narrowed very, very quickly, as you can imagine. I mean, this guy's a big star, okay? So she was living in Eagle, Colorado, outside of Vail, and it turned into just an absolute circus. And she couldn't even go home to see her parents, for example, unless she was like somehow disguised with a blanket over her in the back of a car or something. She had hundreds of death threats. Hundreds of death threats, 2 of which were so serious that 2 different men in 2 different states were investigated, charged, convicted, and sentenced to jail for very legitimate threats against her life. One was a man who left profanity-laced death threats on her home answering machine, and the other was a murder for hire. And both of those people ended up criminally convicted as a result of those actions. The details of her life were posted on the internet and on the international media, so her privacy was very difficult to protect her privacy during the course of this. And she was on the cover of Globe magazine 4 different times. And quite frankly, at the end of 14 months, we were in the process of picking a jury or trying to narrow a jury panel, a very huge jury panel, as you can imagine, because it was such a high-profile case, to try to actually seat a jury. And she said, you know what, I can't go through this anymore. And I guess my question is, could you? I want you to know that these are the facts of the cases. They relate to this person, People versus Kobe Bryant. Okay? Pretty famous basketball player for the Los Angeles Lakers. Many of you may not have paid attention to this, but if you did, here's what I can promise you. This is not the impression that you probably had of this particular case. Right? And so the prosecution dismissed the case, and Kobe Bryant's not convicted of anything. I want you to know that. He's not guilty legally of anything. And I want to say one other thing about the Bryant case. Sometimes one of the reasons I hesitate to use that case is that it reinforces an unfair stereotype, right? You have in that case, you have a black defendant and a white victim. And I want you to know that that is an unfair, overly emphasized, in our criminal justice system, dyad that has not been a fair one. We have disproportionately blamed men of color for this crime for a very long time. And so I need to acknowledge that, because I don't want to reinforce a stereotype that I know is not valid. This is a crime that almost happens within cultures and within races, et cetera. It's black on black, it's white on white, et cetera. But I use this because really what was involved in this case was just unbridled power, money, prestige, et cetera. But I just need to acknowledge that, because the problem that we have, if you picture a coin, 2 sides of a coin, on the one side of the coin we've got victim blaming. And on the other side of the coin, we have holding offenders accountable. And there's this incredible tension on this side of the coin as we flip it in this culture. And what we find is almost all the time, it lands on the side of let's blame the victim. You know why? Because it's easier. Our world is safer if we think we can tell who the people are that do this. And it becomes very unsafe if we can't. And the hard part of this is that we can't. Sex offenders look like all of us. They are among us in every single part of our world, and they don't look like the stinky guy that we all love to hate, at least only 85% of the time. They're not like that. So it's a tough thing that we're up against. And we need to make progress on this, because if we don't, we're going to continue to get the same results that we do. So I want you to just consciously think about taking your focus off of victim behavior and putting it onto offender behavior, which is where, in my opinion, of course, it belongs.